The autumn of 1894 had settled upon London with its characteristic gloom, wrapping the great city in a mantle of fog and drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. It was on such a dreary October morning that I found myself seated across from my friend, Sherlock Holmes, in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, attempting to lose myself in the morning edition of the Times, while Holmes pursued one of his more esoteric chemical experiments. At his cluttered workbench, acrid smell of some unknown substance had driven Mrs. Hudson to protest twice already that morning. But Holmes remained utterly absorbed in his work, his long, nervous fingers manipulating glass tubes and beakers with the precision of a concert violinist. I had learned long ago that when Holmes was between cases, his restless mind would turn to increasingly obscure pursuits, anything to stave off the ennui that plagued him during periods of inactivity. "Watson," he said suddenly, without looking up from his apparatus, "you have been reading the same paragraph for the past 7 minutes. Either the news has become remarkably dense, or your mind is elsewhere entirely." I lowered the newspaper with a slight smile. "You've been counting?" "Observing," he corrected, finally turning to face me. His gray eyes, sharp as ever despite the late night he had spent poring over monographs on tobacco ash, fixed upon me with that peculiar intensity that never failed to make me feel as though I were being examined under a microscope. "You shifted position 3 times, sighed twice, and your eyes have not progressed beyond the 3rd column. Clearly something troubles you." "Not troubles, precisely," I admitted, folding the paper. "I confess I find myself rather at loose ends. My practice requires little attention at present, and I had hoped we might have some diversion, a case perhaps." Holmes's expression brightened considerably. "Ah, Watson, ever the man of action. I share your sentiment entirely. This experiment, while intellectually stimulating, lacks the human element that makes our work so infinitely fascinating." He gestured dismissively at his chemical apparatus. "The reactions of compounds are depressingly predictable compared to the reactions of the human heart under duress." As if in answer to our mutual wish, the sound of rapid footsteps upon the stairs announced a visitor. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, slightly flustered, with a telegram clutched in her hand. "A message for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing him the yellow envelope. The boy said it was most urgent. Holmes took the telegram with barely concealed eagerness, his eyes scanning the contents with remarkable speed. I watched as his features transformed. The boredom that had settled upon him like dust vanished instantly, replaced by that alert, focused expression I knew so well. "Watson," he said, his voice crisp with renewed energy, "fetch your coat and hat. We are summoned to Clerkenwell, to establishment known as Blackwood & Sons, fine printers. It appears that murder has been done, and in circumstances most peculiar." "Murder?" I rose immediately, my pulse quickening. "What does the telegram say?" Holmes handed me the message, and I read, "Mar Sherlock Holmes. Baker Street stop murder most foul at Blackwood Printers. Clerkenwell stop victim locked in pressroom from inside stop nitrogen monoxide. Weapon found stop police baffled stop your immediate. Attendance required stop Inspector Lestrade Scotland Yard. Locked from the inside with no weapon." I mused aloud. How extraordinarily strange. "Indeed," Holmes replied, already shrugging into his overcoat with swift, economical movements. "A locked room mystery, Watson, one of the most intellectually satisfying categories of crime. The impossibility of the thing is what makes it so deliciously possible, once one applies the proper reasoning." He paused at the mirror to adjust his collar, and I caught the gleam of anticipation in his eyes. "Come, my dear fellow. The game, as they say, is afoot. And unless I am very much mistaken, this particular game will prove to be one of considerable complexity." We descended the stairs rapidly, emerging into the damp morning air where Holmes hailed a hansom cab with an imperious wave. As we rattled through the fog-shrouded streets toward Clerkenwell, I found myself studying my companion's profile. Already his mind was at work. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight furrow of concentration upon his brow. "Tell me, Watson," he said without turning his head, "what do you know of the printing trade?" "Very little, I confess. I know that it involves presses, type, ink, the mechanical reproduction of text and images." "Quite so. But consider this. A print shop is a place of heavy machinery, sharp implements, caustic chemicals, and considerable physical labor. If one wished to stage a murder in such a location, the opportunities would be manifold." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his knee. "Yet our murderer, if indeed there is a murderer, has chosen instead to create an impossibility." "Why, Watson? What advantage does complexity offer when simplicity would suffice?" I pondered this question as our cab turned onto Clerkenwell Road. But before I could formulate an answer, we drew up before a narrow, three-story building wedged between a bookbinder's shop and a stationer's warehouse. The sign above the door, painted in elegant but fading letters, read, "Blackwood and Son, S. Fine Printing and Lithography, Est, 1847. A small crowd had gathered on the pavement, despite the early hour and inclement weather, held back by a constable who stood at rigid attention before the entrance. As we alighted from the cab, I caught fragments of hushed conversation, whispers of murder, of curses, of dark doings in the old print shop. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the doorway as we approached, his ferrety face drawn with concern, and I fancied a certain relief at our arrival. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I've seen some strange things in my years with the Yard, but this—" He shook his head. "Well, you'd best see for yourselves. It's on the second floor, the press room where they do the actual printing work." As we followed Lestrade through the narrow entrance, the distinctive smell of printer's inksharp, chemical, faintly metallic, enveloped us. The ground floor appeared to be a reception area and office, with a heavy oak counter and walls lined with samples of the shop's work, calling cards, letterheads, small posters, and elaborately decorated bookplates. Lestrade led us up a steep, creaking staircase to the second floor, where the mechanical heart of the operation lay. Even from the corridor, I could hear the low murmur of voices and see the unusual congregation of people, constables, plainclothes detectives, and what I presumed to be employees of the establishment, all gathered near a door at the end of the passage. "The victim is one Mr. Horace Blackwood," Lestrade explained as we walked. "He was the proprietor, inherited the business from his father some 15 years ago. 62 years of age, widower, lived alone in Islington. According to his foreman, he often came in early to work on special projects. This morning, when the staff arrived at 7 o'clock, they found the pressroom door bolted from the inside and no response to their knocking. And how did they gain entry?" Holmes asked, his eyes already taking in every detail of our surroundings. "Had to break it down," Lestrade replied. "The door was solid oak with iron reinforcements, took 3 men with a sledgehammer. When they finally got through, they found Mr. Blackwood dead on the floor beside the main press, blood everywhere. But here's the thing, Mr. Holmes." He paused for dramatic effect. "There was no weapon anywhere in the room. We've searched every inch. Nothing. We had reached the damaged door, which hung askew on its hinges." Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping across the room beyond with methodical precision. "No one has disturbed the scene since the body was discovered?" he asked sharply. "Only the police surgeon to confirm death," Lestrade assured him. "And I made certain no one touched anything else. I remembered your preferences from our previous cases." "Excellent, Lestrade. You continue to learn." Holmes's tone held a note of approval that brought a flush of pleasure to the inspector's sallow cheeks. "Now then, let us see what story this room has to tell." Holmes stepped across the threshold, and I followed close behind, my medical instincts and curiosity both fully aroused. The sight that greeted us was indeed a grim one, and I felt my professional detachment slip momentarily as I took in the scene of violence before us. The press room was perhaps 30 feet square, dominated by a massive iron printing press that stood like some industrial leviathan in the center of the space. Wooden cases filled with type lined one wall, while the others held shelves of ink cans, tools, and supplies. Windows along the far wall, begrimed with years of London soot, admitted a weak, grayish light that did little to illuminate the shadows. And there, sprawled on the floor beside the great press, lay the body of Horace Blackwood. The body lay face down, one arm extended toward the press as if reaching for something in those final moments. The back of his skull bore a terrible wound, a depression in the bone that spoke of tremendous force. Blood had pooled beneath the head and splattered across the stone floor in a pattern that suggested the blow had been struck where he fell. Mr. Blackwood had been a portly man, dressed in a printer's canvas apron over a waistcoat and shirt sleeves. Now stained dark with his life's blood, I knelt beside the corpse, my medical training asserting itself despite the gruesomeness of the scene. The blow came from behind, I observed, examining the wound without touching. The body, a single strike, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. "Quite so, Watson," Holmes murmured, though his attention had already moved beyond the victim. He stood motionless in the center of the room, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly as if listening to some sound inaudible to the rest of us. It was a habit I had witnessed many times before, Holmes absorbing the totality of a scene, constructing in his mind a three-dimensional map of every object, every surface, every possibility. When his eyes opened again, they blazed with that peculiar intensity that told me his remarkable brain had begun its work in earnest. He moved first to the door through which we had entered, examining the broken bolt with minute attention. "This is the only entrance?" he asked Lestrade. "The only one. Mr. Holmes, the windows are 30 feet above a cobblestone courtyard, no ledges, no drain pipes, no means of access from outside." Holmes produced his magnifying lens and studied the bolt mechanism closely. "The bolt was drawn from the inside, you see, Watson. Note the scratches here on the keeper fresh marks where the metal was forced when they broke through. But here, on the bolt itself, the wear patterns indicate regular use. This lock was functioning normally when it was engaged. Then how did the murderer escape?" I asked, the impossibility of the situation pressing upon me. "An excellent question, my dear fellow. Let us see if the room itself provides an answer." Holmes moved next to the windows, examining each in turn. They were the old-fashioned casement type, painted shut by years of accumulated grime and paint. He tested each one, pushing against the frames with methodical determination. "Firmly sealed," he announced. "It would require considerable effort and noise to open any of these, and there are no signs of recent disturbance." He ran his finger along one windowsill, showing me the undisturbed layer of dust. "No one has passed this way in weeks, perhaps months." I watched as Holmes began a systematic examination of the room, moving in an expanding spiral from the body outward. His lens passed over every surface, the floor, the walls, the printing press itself. Occasionally he would pause, produce a small envelope from his pocket, and carefully collect some minute particle invisible to my eyes. "The weapon. Watson," he said suddenly, straightening from his examination of the floor near the press. "What would you say was used to inflict such a wound?" I considered the question carefully. "Something heavy and blunt. A hammer, perhaps, or an iron bar. The depression suggests a rounded or cylindrical object, roughly 2 inches in diameter." Precisely my own conclusion. "And yet," Holmes gestured around the room, "you see here all the implements of the printing trade. Mallets for setting type, yes. wrenches and spanners for adjusting the machinery, heavy ink cans, wooden blocks, metal bars for the press mechanism. Any of a dozen objects could have served as a murder weapon, and yet none bears any trace of blood or hair that I can detect. Lestrade had been following our examination with growing frustration. "We've already searched, Mr. Holmes. Every drawer, every cupboard, every possible hiding place. There's no weapon here." "Then we are presented with a most intriguing puzzle," Holmes replied, his lips curving into that thin smile that indicated his intellectual appetite had been thoroughly whetted. "A man struck down in a locked room by a weapon that has vanished. The door was bolted from within, the windows sealed, and yet the murderer is not here. Unless," he paused, turning to Lestrade with sudden sharpness, "the body has not been moved since it was discovered?" "Not an inch, I swear it." "And you are certain the room was locked when the employees arrived?" "Certain as I'm standing here. 3 witnesses will testify to it, the foreman and 2 pressmen who helped break down the door." Holmes nodded slowly, and I could see his mind working through possibilities with the speed and precision of one of Mr. Babbage's calculating engines. He returned to the body, circling it slowly, his lens trained on the floor around the corpse. "The blood pattern is consistent with a fall immediately following the blow," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on the hands. The victim was taken entirely by surprise." He straightened suddenly. "Lestrade, at what time was Mr. Blackwood last seen alive?" The inspector consulted his notebook. "Yesterday evening, around 7 o'clock. The foreman, Mr. Thaddeus Cole, was the last to leave. He says Mr. Blackwood told him he would be working late on a special commission, some sort of private printing job. Mr. Cole offered to stay and assist, but Blackwood insisted he could manage alone. So the murder occurred sometime between 7 last evening and 7 this morning. When the body was discovered," Holmes tapped his long fingers against his chin, 12 hours ample time for our murderer to plan and execute his crime. Yet he chose to create this elaborate impossibility rather than simply strike his victim and flee. Why, Watson? What psychological imperative drives a man to such complexity?" Before I could formulate a response, a commotion at the doorway drew our attention. A young woman had pushed past the constable stationed there and now stood in the entrance, her face pale with shock and grief. She was perhaps 25 years of age, dressed in mourning clothes that suggested recent bereavement, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty had it not been twisted with anguish. "Father!" she cried, her voice breaking as her eyes fell upon the covered form on the floor. "Oh God, they said it was true, but I didn't believe I couldn't." She swayed, and I moved quickly to steady her before she could collapse. "Miss Blackwood, I presume," Holmes said gently, moving forward with an expression of concern that I knew he reserved for moments when information might be gleaned from those in distress. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Please accept our condolences for your loss." The young woman allowed me to guide her to a wooden stool near the doorway, well away from the body. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, struggling to compose herself. Lestrade hovered nearby, clearly torn between his duty to preserve the crime scene and his natural sympathy for the bereaved. "I'm sorry," she managed after a moment, her voice steadier though tears streamed down her cheeks. "I shouldn't have come. When the constable arrived at the house this morning with the news, I thought I had to see for myself. Father was all I had left since Mother passed 2 years ago." "Quite understandable," I assured her, noting the tremor in her hands and the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights predating this tragedy. "Perhaps it would be better if you waited downstairs." "This is no place for—" "No," she interrupted, straightening her spine with visible effort. "If Mr. Holmes is investigating my father's death, then I must help however I can. Father spoke of you often, Mr. Holmes. He followed your cases in the newspapers with great interest." She dabbed at her eyes. He would want me to be strong, to assist in finding whoever did this terrible thing. Holmes studied her with an expression I had come to recognize not unkind, but penetrating, as if reading the pages of her life written in the lines of her face and the details of her dress. Miss Blackwood, forgive the indelicacy of my questions, but time is of considerable importance in matters such as these. When did you last see your father? 3 days ago, she replied. I came to the shop on Monday afternoon to bring him lunch. He had been working long hours on a special commission and often forgot to eat properly. This special commission, Holmes continued, his tone casual though I detected the sharp focus beneath it. Did your father discuss its nature with you? Miss Blackwood shook her head. Father could be quite secretive about certain clients, particularly those of wealth or prominence. He said only that it was delicate work requiring privacy, and that he expected to complete it by week's end. He seemed troubled, though distracted. I asked if something was wrong, but he assured me it was merely the pressure of the deadline. Troubled in what way, precisely? Holmes pressed. She considered this carefully. He was not himself. Father was usually meticulous about the shop, everything in its place, but his desk was cluttered with papers he kept shuffling about. And twice during my visit, he went to the window and looked down at the street, as if watching for someone. Holmes exchanged a glance with me that spoke volumes. Did he receive any unusual visitors in recent days? Anyone who might have caused him concern? I couldn't say for certain. I don't come to the shop every day. I have my own household to manage in Islington. But the foreman, Mr. Cole, would know. He's been with Father for 15 years and knows every aspect of the business. Indeed, we shall need to speak with Mr. Cole presently, Holmes said. He moved closer to Miss Blackwood, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. One final question, if you can bear it. Did your father have enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm? The young woman's expression hardened slightly. My father was a good man, Mr. Holmes, honest in his dealings, fair to his employees. But she hesitated, then continued with evident reluctance. There was a dispute several months ago. A former employee named Samuel Giddings was dismissed for theft. He had been stealing supplies and selling them to competitors. Father felt he had no choice but to let him go, though it pained him to do so. Giddings made threats when he left, vile things I won't repeat. He said Father would regret it. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And where might we find this Mr. Giddings now? I don't know. Father reported the threats to the police at the time, but nothing came of it. I believe Giddings left London, though I cannot be certain. Lestrade had been making notes throughout this exchange, and now he cleared his throat. We'll track down Giddings straight away, Mr. Holmes. Sounds like he's got motive aplenty. Perhaps, Holmes replied noncommittally, though I detected a note of skepticism in his voice. He turned back to Miss Blackwood. You have been most helpful. Dr. Watson will escort you downstairs, and I recommend you return home to rest. We shall call upon you later if further questions arise. I offered my arm to Miss Blackwood, who accepted it gratefully. As I guided her toward the door, I heard Holmes addressing Lestrade in low tones about securing the premises and preventing any disturbance to the scene. We descended the narrow staircase slowly, Miss Blackwood leaning heavily upon me at the ground floor. We found a small group of men clustered near the counter, the shop's employees. I surmised, prevented from entering their workplace by the police investigation. One of them, a burly man of perhaps 50 with ink-stained hands and a weathered face, stepped forward immediately upon seeing Miss Blackwood. Miss Catherine, he said, his gruff voice thick with emotion. I'm that sorry about your father. A finer man never lived, and that's God's truth. Thank you, Mr. Cole, she replied, managing a wan smile through her tears. I know Father valued your loyalty above all things. This, then, was Thaddeus Cole, the foreman who had been last to see Horace Blackwood alive. I studied him with interest, noting the genuine grief in his red-rimmed eyes and the slump of his broad shoulders. Whatever else he might be, this man had cared deeply for his employer. "Mr. Cole," I said, "I am Dr. Watson, assisting Mr. Sherlock Holmes in the investigation. I'm certain the inspector will wish to speak with you shortly, but perhaps you could tell me, was there anything unusual about Mr. Blackwood's behavior yesterday evening when you left?" Cole rubbed his bristled jaw thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, Doctor, there was." The master seemed nervous-like, kept checking his watch and looking toward the door. When I asked if he wanted me to stay, he was quite firm about me leaving. Said he needed privacy for his work, and that I should make certain all the lads left promptly at 7. Most particular about that, he was. Did he say why he required such privacy? I pressed, sensing that Cole knew more than he had yet revealed. The foreman shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at Miss Blackwood before answering. "Not in so many words, Doctor. But I got the impression he was expecting someone he didn't want the rest of us to see. He'd been that way for near a week, working late into the evenings, always alone. The Special Commission, he called it, though he never showed me the work nor told me what it was for. And in all your years with Mr. Blackwood, had he ever been so secretive before?" Cole scratched his chin, considering. "Can't say he had, not to this degree. Oh, we've done private work before wedding invitations for the gentry, personal stationery, that sort of thing. But the master always shared the work with me, proud-like. This was different. He kept the materials locked in his personal cabinet upstairs, worked on them after hours when no one else was about." Miss Blackwood had been listening intently, and now she spoke up with a tremor in her voice. "Mr. Cole, do you think this commission had something to do with Father's death?" The foreman's expression darkened. "I couldn't say, Miss Catherine, but it troubles me considerable that we can't find any trace of it now. When we broke into the press room this morning, there was no special work anywhere to be seen, no plates, no proofs, no finished prints. Whatever your father was working on, it's vanished along with the devil what killed him." This revelation struck me with considerable force. "The work has disappeared? Are you quite certain?" "As certain as I'm standing here," Cole affirmed. "I've been through that room 100 times in my years here. I know every corner, every cabinet. There's nothing there that shouldn't be, and nothing there that could be this mysterious commission. Unless," he paused, a troubled look crossing his weathered features. "Unless what, Mr. Cole?" I prompted. "Unless he'd already delivered it. But that seems unlikely, given he was still here working last night. And if someone came to collect it, why would they kill him? Makes no sense, Doctor, no sense at all." Before I could pursue this line of inquiry further, Holmes descended the stairs with his characteristic swift grace, Lestrade trailing behind him. My friend's eyes immediately found mine, and I saw in them that peculiar brightness that indicated his mind was racing through possibilities at tremendous speed. "Mr. Cole, I presume?" Holmes said, approaching the foreman with his hand extended. "I am Sherlock Holmes. Your observations will be invaluable to this investigation. But first," he turned to Miss Blackwood with a courteous nod. "Miss Blackwood, I must insist that Dr. Watson escort you home. You have had a terrible shock, and what I must discuss with Mr. Cole contains details that would only distress you further." Miss Blackwood looked as though she might protest, but the firm kindness in Holmes's voice seemed to persuade her. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, but you will keep me informed? I must know what happened to my father." "You have my word," Holmes assured her. "Watson, see that Miss Blackwood reaches home safely, then return here with all haste. There is much to be done." I escorted the young woman out into the drizzling rain and hailed a cab, ensuring she was safely inside before giving the driver her address in Islington. As the cab pulled away, I saw her pale face at the window, her handkerchief pressed to her eyes. The poor woman had lost both parents within 2 years, a tragedy compounded now by the violent and mysterious nature of her father's death. I returned to the print shop within 20 minutes to find Holmes, Lestrade, and Cole assembled in the small office on the ground floor. Holmes had commandeered the desk and was examining a ledger with intense concentration, while Cole stood nearby wringing his ink-stained hands nervously. Lestrade caught my eye and gave a slight shake of his head, as if to say that little progress had been made in my absence. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said without looking up from the ledger. "Excellent timing. Mr. Cole has been most cooperative in providing access to the business records. Tell me, Cole, this entry here from a week ago, £5 withdrawn from petty cash with no notation as to purpose. Is that customary?" Cole leaned over to examine the entry Holmes indicated. "That's unusual, Mr. Holmes. The master was always meticulous about recording every expense, down to the last farthing. If there's no notation, it means he didn't want anyone knowing what the money was for." "Precisely my conclusion," Holmes murmured. He flipped back several pages. "And here, 3 weeks prior, another withdrawal of £10, again with no explanation. Yet in all the months before that, every penny is accounted for with painful precision." He looked up at Cole with that penetrating gaze. "What changed 3 weeks ago, Mr. Cole? What happened that caused your employer to begin acting so out of character?" The foreman's brow furrowed in thought. 3 weeks ago? That would have been just after the Lithographers Guild meeting. The master attended, as he did every month. He came back quite agitated, I recall. Went straight up to his office and didn't come down for hours. "The Lithographers Guild," Holmes repeated, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "An association of printers and engravers, I presume?" "That's right, sir. All the respectable print shops in London belong to it. They meet the 3rd Tuesday of every month at the Crown and Anchor on Fleet Street. Discuss business matters, new techniques, that sort of thing." Holmes rose from the desk and began pacing the small office with that restless energy I knew so well. "Watson, we begin to see the outline of something here, though the picture remains frustratingly incomplete. A man of regular habits and meticulous nature suddenly becomes secretive. He withdraws money without explanation, works alone on a mysterious commission, acts nervous, and watches the street as if expecting or fearing someone's arrival. Then he is murdered in a locked room, the weapon vanishes, and his work disappears along with it." "It suggests blackmail," I ventured, the pieces beginning to form a pattern in my mind. Perhaps Blackwood discovered something at that guild meeting, something someone was willing to kill to keep secret. "An excellent hypothesis, Watson, and one that bears investigation." Holmes turned back to Cole with renewed intensity. "This guild meeting 3 weeks ago, do you know who else attended? Any names that might be significant?" Cole rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I couldn't give you a complete list, Mr. Holmes, but I know most of the regular members. There's old Marcus Pemberton from Pemberton and Webb. They do all the society wedding invitations. Young Timothy Ashford, who runs the shop on Ludgate Hill. Bernard Cunningham, though he's more of an engraver than a printer proper. And of course, there was always tension with Edgar Mallory." At the mention of this last name, Holmes's entire demeanor sharpened. "Mallory? In what way was there tension?" "Mallory runs the biggest print shop in Clerkenwell, 3 times the size of ours, with modern steam presses and a staff of 30. He's been trying to buy out the smaller shops for years, offering prices well below market value. The master refused him twice, said he'd rather burn the place down than sell to the likes of Mallory. They had words at the last few meetings, getting quite heated at times." Lestrade, who had been listening intently, now interjected. "This Mallory, he sounds like a man worth questioning. If Blackwood was standing in the way of his business expansion—" "Perhaps," Holmes interrupted, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "But murder is a rather extreme solution to a business dispute, particularly when conducted in such an elaborate fashion. Still, we must explore every avenue." He fixed Cole with an inquiring look. "This dismissed employee, Miss Blackwood, mentioned Samuel Giddings. What can you tell me of him?" The foreman's expression soured immediately. "A bad lot, that one. Giddings worked here as a pressman for near 3 years. Good with his hands when he chose to be, but lazy and always complaining about his wages. When we discovered he'd been stealing ink, paper, even brass type to sell for scrap, the master had no choice but to let him go. Giddings didn't take it well. Made all manner of threats, said the master would pay for ruining his reputation. When was this dismissal?" "4 months back in June. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since. Though I heard he was lodging somewhere in Shoreditch. Drinking himself into debt." Holmes nodded slowly, processing this information with that remarkable mental filing system of his. "And during his employment, would Giddings have had access to keys for the press room?" "Aye, all the regular employees have keys. We open at 7 sharp, and the lads need to be able to get to their workstations." Cole's eyes widened as he grasped the implication. "You think Giddings might have kept his key?" "Used it to get in, and I think nothing yet," Holmes said curtly. "I am merely gathering facts. Tell me, when you arrived this morning and found the door locked, did you attempt to use your own key?" "I did, sir. But the bolt was thrown on the inside, so the key was useless. That's why we had to break it down." Holmes began pacing again, his hands clasped behind his back. "So we have a door that was definitely bolted from within, eliminating the possibility of someone simply locking it from outside and departing. We have a victim who was expecting someone, who was working on a secret commission that has now vanished. We have a disgruntled former employee with motive and means, and a business rival with much to gain from Blackwood's death." He stopped abruptly, turning to face us all. "And yet something about this entire scenario troubles me deeply. The locked room, the missing weapon, the disappeared work, it all feels staged, theatrical. Our murderer is clever, perhaps too clever for his own good." "What do you mean?" Lestrade asked, clearly puzzled. "I mean, Inspector, that the very impossibility of this crime may be its weakness. When a murderer goes to such lengths to create a puzzle, he invariably leaves clues in the mechanism of his deception. The question is whether we are astute enough to recognize them." Holmes consulted his watch. "It is now nearly 11 o'clock. Lestrade, I suggest you send men to locate both Giddings and Mallory. I wish to interview them both before the day is out, Mr. Cole. You will remain here and prepare a complete inventory of everything in the press room, every tool, every implement, every item that might conceivably have been used as a weapon. Compare it against your normal stock and note anything missing, no matter how insignificant it might seem." "Right away, Mr. Holmes," Cole said, clearly grateful to have a concrete task to occupy him. "Watson and I," Holmes continued, "will pay a visit to the Crown and Anchor. I wish to speak with the proprietor about this guild meeting and learn precisely what transpired that so disturbed our victim." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "One more thing, Cole. Mr. Blackwood's personal cabinet upstairs. You mentioned he kept materials locked there. Has it been examined?" "The police looked through it this morning, sir. Nothing unusual, just paper samples, some old account books, personal correspondence. No sign of any special commission work." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "I should like to examine that cabinet myself. But first, the public house. Come, Watson. We have much ground to cover, and I have a feeling that time is not on our side." As we emerged once more into the damp October air, I found myself reflecting on the curious nature of the case. Every new piece of information seemed to deepen rather than clarify the mystery. A locked room, a vanished weapon, a missing commission. Suspects multiplying like Hydra heads, and at the center of it all, a dead man who had been afraid of something or someone in the days before his death. "Holmes," I said as we walked briskly toward Fleet Street, "do you have a theory yet? Some sense of what really happened in that press room?" My friend was silent for a long moment, his profile sharp against the gray sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost distant. I have several theories, Watson, each more improbable than the last. The difficulty lies not in the absence of clues, but in their very abundance. We have too many suspects, too many motives, and an impossibility at the heart of it all that defies rational explanation. He glanced at me with a slight smile. But that, my dear fellow, is precisely what makes this case so fascinating. The human mind recoils from impossibility. And yet when we eliminate all other explanations, however improbable the remaining answer may be, it must be the truth. The Crown and Anchor was a respectable establishment. Its dark wood paneling and brass fixtures, speaking of a clientele drawn from the professional classes rather than the rough laborers of the docks. At this hour, the public house was relatively quiet, with only a handful of patrons nursing pints at scattered tables. The proprietor, a stout man with mutton-chop whiskers and a pristine white apron, approached us with the practiced affability of his profession. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" Holmes produced one of his cards with a flourish. "Information, rather than libation, I'm afraid. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the death of Mr. Horace Blackwood. And I understand that the Lithographers' Guild holds its monthly meetings here." The proprietor's jovial expression faded immediately, replaced by genuine shock. "Horace Blackwood dead? Good Lord, I hadn't heard. When did this happen?" "His body was discovered this morning, though we believe he was killed sometime last night." "You knew him then?" "Knew him? I should say so. Fine gentleman, always prompt with his payments for the meeting room hire. The guild has been meeting here for near 20 years. The proprietor shook his head sadly. "Terrible business. Murdered, you say?" "Most foully," Holmes confirmed. "We are particularly interested in the meeting that took place 3 weeks ago. Were you present during any part of it?" The proprietor wiped his hands on his apron, his brow furrowing. "I was in and out, serving drinks and such. Can't say I paid much attention to their discussions, mostly technical matters about inks and papers and whatnot. But I do recall there was some heated debate that evening. Voices were raised, which was unusual for that lot. Generally a quiet, respectable group. Can you recall the nature of this debate?" Holmes pressed, leaning forward intently. "Something about standards, I think. Quality control, professional ethics, that sort of thing. One gentleman in particular was quite vocal, saying the guild needed to take a firmer stance against shops that engaged in questionable practices. There was pushback from others who said it wasn't the guild's place to police the trade. Do you remember who this vocal gentleman was?" The proprietor scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Couldn't give you a name, sir. I know most of them by sight, but not all by name. Middle-aged fellow, well-dressed, spoke with considerable passion about maintaining the integrity of the profession. That could describe half the guild." I murmured to Holmes. "Indeed," my friend replied. "What about Mr. Blackwood specifically? Did you observe his reactions during this debate?" "Now that you mention it, yes. Mr. Blackwood seemed quite troubled by the whole discussion. He didn't speak much himself, but I saw him making notes in a small book he always carried. After the meeting broke up, he lingered behind with 2 or 3 others, most unusual, as he was typically among the first to leave." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Who were these others with whom he lingered?" "I'm afraid I can't be certain, Mr. Holmes. I was clearing tables and seeing to other customers. But I do remember hearing one of them mention something about forgery. The word stuck with me because it seemed such a serious accusation. Forgery." Holmes repeated softly, and I saw his entire aspect change, as though a switch had been thrown in that remarkable brain. "Most interesting. Tell me, in your experience, would such an accusation be common in discussions among printers?" The proprietor shook his head firmly. "Never heard such a thing before, sir. The guild members are all respectable tradesmen, proud of their craft. An accusation of forgery would be a grave matter indeed. It would mean someone was producing counterfeit documents, falsifying signatures, that sort of criminal activity. It could destroy a man's reputation and livelihood. Holmes fell silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep concentration. I could practically see the wheels turning in his mind, connecting disparate threads of information into some larger pattern that remained, as yet, invisible to me. One final question, Holmes said at length. After that meeting, did Mr. Blackwood return for the subsequent monthly gathering? He did, sir. Just 2 weeks ago. But he seemed quite withdrawn, not his usual self at all. Left early, I recall, before the discussion had even properly concluded. Holmes thanked the proprietor and pressed a coin into his hand, then steered me back out into the street. The drizzle had intensified to a steady rain, and we huddled beneath the overhang of a tobacconist's shop while Holmes lit his pipe. That infallible sign that his mind was working at full capacity. Watson, we begin to see light breaking through the darkness. Forgery, secret commissions, a man suddenly acting out of character, it all points in a rather disturbing direction. You think Blackwood discovered someone in the guild was engaged in forgery? I ventured. More than that, my dear fellow. I believe Blackwood may have been approached to participate in such an enterprise, or perhaps he inadvertently witnessed something that revealed the operation. The secret commission, the money withdrawn without notation, the nervousness, these all suggest a man caught in a web, not of his own making. But if he was being blackmailed or coerced into forging documents, why would the perpetrator kill him? Surely he was more valuable alive? An excellent point, Watson, and one that suggests our theory requires refinement. Perhaps Blackwood refused to cooperate. Perhaps he threatened to expose the scheme. Or perhaps, Holmes paused, his pipe sending up elaborate wreaths of blue smoke. Perhaps the commission was already complete, and Blackwood had become a liability rather than an asset. The implications of this sent a chill through me, despite the closeness of the day. Then the murderer took the forged documents when he killed, Blackwood eliminating both the witness and the evidence in one stroke. Precisely. And if my reasoning is correct, those documents are now in circulation, being used for whatever nefarious purpose they were created to serve. Holmes knocked the ash from his pipe with a sharp tap against the wall. We must move quickly, Watson. Lestrade's men will be searching for Giddings and Mallory. But I suspect our true quarry is someone far more subtle, someone who moves in respectable circles, someone who would have both the means and the motive to commission forgeries of sufficient quality to require Blackwood's expertise. But what sort of documents would be worth killing for? I asked. Surely not simple calling cards or invitations? Consider the possibilities, my friend. A master printer with access to the finest papers, the most precise type, the most sophisticated presses. Such a man could produce documents virtually indistinguishable from the originals. Bank drafts, stock certificates, letters of credit, legal contracts, even government documents. In the wrong hands, such forgeries could facilitate frauds worth thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of pounds. The scope of it staggered me. Good Lord, Holmes. You're suggesting an organized criminal enterprise of considerable sophistication. I am suggesting nothing, yet merely following the logical implications of what we have learned. But yes, the pieces do seem to point towards something far more complex than a simple murder born of personal animosity. He pulled his coat tighter against the rain. Come, we must return to Baker Street. I need to consult my index and perhaps send a few telegrams. There are certain inquiries that must be made with discretion. We hailed a cab and rode in silence through the rain-slicked streets, Holmes lost in that intense cogitation that I knew better than to interrupt. When we reached our lodgings, he went immediately to his desk and began pulling volumes from his meticulously organized index, a vast collection of newspaper clippings, personal notes. and miscellaneous information on every criminal and questionable character in London. I settled into my chair and watched as he flipped through the pages with practiced speed, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper at his elbow. Mrs. Hudson brought us lunch, which Holmes ignored entirely while I ate mechanically, my mind still grappling with the implications of our morning's work. After perhaps an hour of this concentrated research, Holmes leaned back with a satisfied expression. Ah, yes, I thought the name seemed familiar. Edgar Mallory, the business rival Cole mentioned. 5 years ago, he was investigated by Scotland Yard in connection with a scheme involving fraudulent railway bonds. Nothing was ever proven, and the case was quietly dropped. But the investigating officer's notes suggest Mallory had connections to a printing operation that produced the false certificates. Then he's our man, I exclaimed. Possibly, Watson, but let us not leap to conclusions. The fact that Mallory was once suspected of involvement in a forgery scheme does not necessarily mean he orchestrated this particular crime. We must consider all possibilities. He rose and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. What we need is leverage, some way to force the guilty party to reveal himself. And I believe I know how we might accomplish that. Before he could elaborate, we heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs, and a moment later Lestrade burst into our sitting room, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, we found Samuel Giddings. He's being held at the Yard for questioning. And there's something else, something you need to know about. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What have you discovered, Lestrade? One of my constables was making inquiries in Shoreditch, following up on Giddings's last known address. A pawnbroker near Brick Lane came forward, said a man matching Giddings's description tried to sell him a brass printing plate yesterday evening around 8 o'clock. The pawnbroker refused it because the man seemed drunk and desperate, and the plate looked valuable enough that he suspected it might be stolen. A brass plate, Holmes murmured, his eyes distant. That is most intriguing. Did the pawnbroker describe this plate in any detail? Lestrade consulted his notebook. He said it was about 6 inches square, with engraved lettering and decorative borders. Too fine for ordinary work, he thought. The man Giddings, we presume, wanted £5 for it, but the pawnbroker sent him away. And where did Giddings go from there? That we don't know. The pawnbroker says he headed east, toward Whitechapel. But here's the thing, Mr. Holmes, if Giddings had a brass printing plate from Blackwood's shop, and he was trying to sell it yesterday evening, that was several hours before the murder was discovered, but possibly after it was committed. I sat forward in my chair, the implications dawning on me. Then Giddings could have been at the scene. He might have stolen the plate after killing Blackwood, then fled. Or, Holmes interjected, he might have come upon the scene after the murder was already committed and taken advantage of the situation to steal something of value. Or the plate might have been in his possession from his previous employment and have nothing to do with the current crime. We cannot assume causation from correlation alone. Lestrade looked somewhat deflated by this assessment. Well, in any case, we've got him in custody. Would you like to question him yourself? Holmes considered this for a moment, then shook his head. Not yet, I think. Let him stew for a few hours. Fear and uncertainty will make him more pliable when the time comes. In the meantime, Lestrade, I need you to do something for me. Send men to watch Edgar Mallory's premises, both his business and his home. I want to know everyone who comes and goes, particularly anyone carrying packages or papers. But they must be discreet. Mallory is no fool, and if he suspects surveillance, he may destroy evidence or flee. I'll see to it personally, Lestrade assured him, though his expression betrayed some confusion at Holmes's strategy. But I don't understand why we're not moving on Mallory directly if you suspect him. Because, my dear Inspector, suspicion is not evidence, and we have precious little of the latter at present. What we need is for our quarry to make a mistake, to act in a way that reveals his hand. If we press too quickly, we may alert him to our suspicions and lose our only advantage. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-streaked street below. No, we must be patient. We must watch and wait for the right moment to strike. After Lestrade departed, promising to send word the moment any developments occurred, Holmes remained at the window for several minutes, his profile etched against the gray afternoon light. I could sense the tension in him, that peculiar restlessness that always manifested when a case approached its critical juncture. "Watson," he said suddenly, turning to face me, "I am going to ask you to undertake a rather unusual task this evening. I need you to visit Miss Blackwood and examine her father's personal effects, his correspondence, his papers, anything that might shed light on his activities during these past 3 weeks. I would go myself, but I have other business that requires my attention." "Of course," I replied. But what business could be more pressing than questioning the bereaved daughter? "The business of setting a trap," Holmes said cryptically. "I intend to pay a visit to the offices of the Lithographers' Guild and examine their meeting minutes. If my theory is correct, there should be some record of the discussion about forgery, some indication of who raised the accusation and who responded most vehemently to it. Such records are often more revealing than their authors intend." "You think the murderer will have betrayed himself in the meeting minutes?" "Not directly, perhaps, but the pattern of debate, the defensive reactions, the subsequent absences, these can all provide valuable insights to someone trained in observation." He consulted his watch. "It is now 3 o'clock. The guild secretary maintains offices on Paternoster Row. If I leave now, I should catch him before he closes for the day. You should call on Miss Blackwood around 5 early enough to catch her at home, but late enough that she will have had some time to compose herself." I agreed to this plan, and Holmes departed shortly thereafter, leaving me to spend the next 2 hours in restless contemplation of the case. The locked room still troubled me profoundly. Every theory we had constructed seemed to founder on that central impossibility. How had the murderer escaped from a room bolted from the inside, taking both his weapon and Blackwood's mysterious commission with him? At 4:30, I roused myself and prepared for my visit to Miss Blackwood's residence. The rain had finally ceased, though the streets remained slick and treacherous. I took a cab to Islington, rehearsing in my mind the delicate questions I would need to ask a woman still raw with grief. Miss Blackwood's home proved to be a modest but respectable terrace house on a quiet street lined with plane trees. A maid admitted me and showed me to a small sitting room where Miss Blackwood sat near the fire, still dressed in her morning clothes, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She rose as I entered, managing a wan smile. "Dr. Watson, I did not expect to see you again so soon. Has Mr. Holmes discovered something?" "The investigation is progressing," I assured her, taking the seat she offered. "But Mr. Holmes has asked me to examine your father's personal papers, if you would permit it. We believe something in his recent correspondence might provide a vital clue." She nodded slowly. "Of course, anything that might help find his killer. Father's study is upstairs. He kept all his important documents there. I'll show you." The study was a small, book-lined room that spoke of a man of methodical habits and scholarly inclinations. A roll-top desk dominated one wall, its surface neat and organized despite the profusion of papers, letters, and ledgers that occupied every available space. Miss Blackwood stood in the doorway, seemingly reluctant to enter. "I haven't been able to bring myself to touch his things," she said softly. "It feels like an intrusion, even now." "I understand," I said gently. "Perhaps you might prepare some tea while I work. This may take some time." Grateful for the excuse to leave, she departed, and I turned my attention to the desk. I began systematically, as I had seen Holmes do countless times, examining each document for anything unusual or significant. Most proved to be routine business correspondence orders from clients. Invoices from suppliers, letters regarding guild matters. But then, tucked into a leather portfolio at the back of one drawer, I found something that made my pulse quicken. It was a letter, written in an educated hand on expensive cream-colored paper, dated 2 weeks earlier. The content was brief, but deeply troubling. The letter read, "Mr. Blackwood, your continued silence on this matter is noted and appreciated. The final payment will be delivered upon completion of the work, as agreed. Destroy this correspondence immediately upon reading. Trust that discretion serves both our interests equally." There was no signature, no return address, nothing to identify the sender beyond the quality of the paper and the precise, almost mechanical penmanship. But the implications were staggering. This was evidence that Blackwood had indeed been engaged in some secretive transaction, one that required absolute discretion and the destruction of all written proof. I searched further and found 2 more letters in the same hand, each more insistent than the last about the need for speed and secrecy. The most recent, dated just 3 days before Blackwood's death, contained a barely veiled threat: "Time grows short and patience wears thin. Complete the work or face consequences you will find most unpleasant." I was still examining these letters when Miss Blackwood returned with the tea tray. She set it down and noticed immediately the papers in my hands. "What have you found, Dr. Watson? Your expression suggests something significant." I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, but her steady gaze and evident courage convinced me she deserved the truth. "Your father was being coerced into performing some kind of work that required absolute secrecy. These letters suggest he was reluctant, but ultimately agreed, perhaps because he feared the consequences of refusal." Her face paled as she absorbed this information. "Coerced? You mean blackmailed?" But father was an honest man. He had nothing in his past that could be used against him. "Perhaps not in his own past," I said carefully, watching her reaction. "But blackmail can take many forms. A threat to his business, to someone he cared about. Even a threat to expose some innocent association that might be misconstrued." I paused, then asked gently, "Miss Blackwood, was there anyone in your father's life who might have held such power over him? Anyone whose welfare he would have sacrificed his principles to protect?" She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her temples. "I don't know, Dr. Watson. Father was a private man in many ways. He had his business associates, his guild connections, but few close friends. After Mother died, he became even more withdrawn, pouring all his energy into the shop." She looked up at me with sudden intensity. But there was something I only half remembered until this moment. "About 6 months ago, I came to visit him unexpectedly at the shop. He was meeting with a gentleman in his office, and when I knocked, both of them seemed startled, almost guilty. Father introduced the man as a potential client, but the way they looked at each other, there was tension there, something unspoken. Can you describe this man?" "Tall, well-dressed, perhaps 50 years of age. Distinguished looking, with gray at his temples and a commanding presence. He had a silver-topped walking stick that he kept, tapping against the floor while they spoke. I remember the sound distinctly. And his eyes," she shuddered slightly. "They were cold, calculating. He looked at me as though I were an inconvenience, something to be dismissed and forgotten." This description stirred something in my memory, though I could not immediately place it. "Did your father mention this man again after that meeting?" "Never, and when I asked about him later that day, father became evasive, said it was nothing of importance. But I could tell he was troubled. He was distracted for days afterward." I carefully folded the letters and placed them in my pocket. "Miss Blackwood, these will need to be examined by Mr. Holmes. They may provide crucial evidence. Is there anything else, any other correspondence, any visitors you can recall? Anything at all that seemed out of the ordinary in these past few months?" She thought for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There was one other thing," though I don't know if it's relevant. About a month ago, Father asked me about my mother's maiden name and the date of their marriage. He said he was updating some legal documents and wanted to verify the information. It struck me as odd at the time because surely he would remember such things without asking. But I thought perhaps his memory was beginning to fail with age. Her maiden name? This seemed a curious detail. What was it? Winthrop. Catherine Winthrop. She came from a respectable family in Hampshire, though they've all passed on now. I made a mental note of this, uncertain of its significance, but knowing that Holmes would want every detail. As I prepared to leave, Miss Blackwood touched my arm with a pleading gesture. "Dr. Watson, please tell me honestly, do you believe Father was involved in something criminal? The thought that he might have betrayed his principles, even under duress, is almost more than I can bear." I chose my words carefully. "I believe your father was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. Whatever he did because he felt he had no choice. That does not make him a criminal, Miss Blackwood, it makes him a victim. Just as surely as if he had been struck down without warning." This seemed to comfort her somewhat, and I took my leave with promises to keep her informed of any developments. The cab ride back to Baker Street through the gathering dusk gave me time to reflect on what I had learned. The letters were damning evidence of coercion, but they raised as many questions as they answered. Who was the author? What was the nature of the work demanded? And most pressingly, had Blackwood completed it before his death, or had his murder been punishment for failure? I found Holmes already returned to our lodgings, seated in his chair with his pipe going at full force, surrounded by papers and documents. His expression was one of intense satisfaction, and I knew immediately that his own investigations had borne fruit. "Ah, Watson!" he exclaimed as I entered. "Perfect timing. I trust your visit to Miss Blackwood was productive?" "Most productive," I replied, producing the letters from my pocket. She also provided a description of a mysterious visitor from 6 months ago who may have been the author of these communications. Holmes seized the letters with eager hands, his eyes scanning them rapidly. As he read, I saw his expression shift from interest to excitement to grim satisfaction. When he finished, he looked up at me with eyes that blazed with intellectual fire. "Excellent work, Watson. These letters confirm my suspicions entirely. And combined with what I discovered this afternoon, they provide the final pieces of our puzzle." He rose and began pacing with barely contained energy. The guild meeting minutes were most illuminating. The discussion about forgery was not theoretical, as I had initially supposed. A specific accusation was made. One member accused another of producing fraudulent documents for criminal purposes. The accused denied it vehemently, and the matter was tabled pending further investigation. "Who was accused?" I asked, leaning forward. "That is where the matter becomes delicate. The accused was Bernard Cunningham, a well-respected engraver who has done work for several government ministries. The accuser was none other than Horace Blackwood himself." I felt my jaw drop. Blackwood accused Cunningham? But then, precisely, Watson. We have been looking at this case from entirely the wrong angle. Blackwood was not the forger, he was the whistleblower. And these letters are not instructions for creating forgeries. They are threats designed to silence him, to prevent him from pursuing his accusations further. Then Cunningham is our murderer? Holmes held up a cautionary hand. Not necessarily. Consider the sequence of events. Blackwood makes his accusation 3 weeks ago. Within days, he begins receiving threatening letters. He withdraws money without explanation, perhaps to hire private investigators or to prepare for legal action. He works late on a special commission. But what if that commission was not forgery at all, but rather the preparation of evidence against Cunningham? Documentation of his crimes, proof to support the accusation? The pieces were falling into place with dizzying speed. And when Cunningham realized that Blackwood had compiled evidence against him, he had no choice but to eliminate him and destroy whatever documentation existed. Exactly so. But here is where our locked room mystery becomes comprehensible. Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved a sheet of paper covered with his precise handwriting and small diagrams. This afternoon, while examining the guild records, I also made inquiries about Bernard Cunningham's background. He is not merely an engraver, Watson. He is a former engineer who worked for several years, designing printing machinery before turning to the artistic side of the trade. His technical knowledge would be formidable. But how does that explain the locked door? Holmes's eyes gleamed with triumph. Because, my dear Watson, the door was never locked by the murderer at all. Consider the physical evidence. The bolt was thrown from the inside, yes. The windows were sealed, yes. But what if Blackwood himself locked that door? I stared at him in bewilderment. Why would a man lock himself in with his murderer? He didn't. He locked himself in alone, believing himself safe from any external threat. But what if the threat was not external at all? What if the murderer was already inside the room before Blackwood arrived? The brilliance of it struck me like a physical blow. Hidden. The murderer concealed himself in the press room, waited for Blackwood to enter and bolt the door, then struck him down and escaped. But how? The door remained locked until morning. Ah, but did it? Holmes asked with maddening composure. The foreman testified that when they arrived at 7 o'clock, the door was bolted and they had to break it down. But consider this. At what time did Blackwood typically arrive at the shop? Cole said he often came in early for special projects. Perhaps 6 o'clock or even earlier. Precisely. Now the body was discovered at 7 when the regular staff arrived. But what if Blackwood had been dead for hours by that point? What if the murder occurred late the previous evening, shortly after Cole departed at 7? Holmes began pacing again, his hands gesturing as he reconstructed the crime. Cunningham, knowing Blackwood's habits, conceals himself in the press room before the shop, closes perhaps in one of the large storage cabinets or behind the press itself. Cole and the other workers depart. Blackwood arrives, believing himself alone, and bolts the door to ensure his privacy while he works on compiling his evidence. Cunningham emerges from hiding and strikes him down. But the door, Holmes. How did Cunningham escape with the door still bolted? A smile played at the corners of Holmes's mouth. He didn't escape immediately, Watson. That is the genius of it. Cunningham remained in the locked room with his victim's body for hours, all through the night, calmly searching for and removing every scrap of evidence Blackwood had compiled against him. And then, shortly before 7 o'clock, when he knew the workers would arrive, he unbolted the door from the inside and simply walked out. I shook my head, confused. But that's impossible. The workers testified that the door was bolted when they arrived. Did they? Or did they testify that the door would not open when they tried it? Let me ask you this, Watson. If you arrived at work and found your employer's office door closed and unresponsive to knocking, what would you assume? That it was locked, naturally. Precisely. And if, upon trying the door and finding it would not open, you assumed the bolt was thrown, would you actually verify this assumption before breaking down the door? The cunning of it took my breath away. You're suggesting Cunningham held the door closed from the outside, while the workers attempted to open it, allowing them to believe it was bolted? Not held it closed, that would require impossible strength against 3 determined men. No, something far more elegant. Watson, do you recall the description of the door? Heavy oak with iron reinforcements and a bolt mechanism on the inside. Yes, but I don't see. The bolt slides into a keeper mounted on the doorframe. A simple mechanism, but effective. Now, suppose someone had access to the press room the previous day and took the time to make a small modification, perhaps drilling a tiny hole through the doorframe at precisely the right location, allowing a wire or thin metal rod to be inserted from the outside to manipulate the bolt. I felt my excitement growing. Then Cunningham could have unbolted the door in the early morning, walked out, and immediately rebolted it from the outside using this mechanism. When the workers arrived and found the door immovable, they naturally assumed it was bolted from within. Exactly. And when they finally broke through with their sledgehammer, the damage would have destroyed any evidence of the small hole. The splintered wood, the bent metal of the keeper, all would appear to be the natural result of forced entry. Holmes tapped his pipe against the mantelpiece with satisfaction. It is the perfect locked room mystery, Watson, because the room was never truly locked at the critical moment. The appearance of impossibility was created through simple mechanical means and the exploitation of human assumption. But Holmes, this is all theory. How can we prove any of it? We cannot, not yet. But we can test it. Tomorrow morning, I intend to return to the print shop and examine that doorframe with the utmost care. If I am correct, there will be traces wood dust, perhaps, or scratches that predate the forced entry. And more importantly, we must locate the missing evidence that Blackwood compiled. Cunningham removed it from the press room, but he could not have had time to destroy it completely. It must be somewhere in his possession, in his premises, hidden but not yet destroyed. At that moment, a sharp knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Hudson appeared, slightly flustered, with a telegram in her hand. "Mr. Holmes, this just arrived." The boy said it was most urgent. Holmes tore open the envelope and scanned the contents, his expression darkening. "It's from Lestrade. Samuel Giddings has confessed to Blackwood's murder." I felt my carefully constructed understanding of the case shatter. Confessed? But that's impossible. Your entire theory is precisely correct, Holmes finished, his voice sharp with certainty. This confession is false, Watson. Giddings is either lying to protect someone, or more likely, he has been coerced into taking the blame. He seized his coat from the rack with swift, decisive movements. We must get to Scotland Yard immediately. If Lestrade accepts this confession at face value, the real murderer will escape justice entirely. The handsome ride through the evening streets was tense and silent. Holmes's jaw set in grim determination while I wrestled with the implications of this new development. A false confession was not unprecedented in criminal investigations. Fear, confusion, or manipulation could drive even an innocent man to claim guilt. But the timing troubled me deeply. Why would Giddings confess now, mere hours after his arrest? We found Lestrade in his office at Scotland Yard, looking simultaneously relieved and exhausted. Several other officers stood about, their expressions betraying the satisfaction of a case apparently solved. The inspector rose as we entered, his ferret-like features arranged in a smile of triumph. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you've heard the news, I see. Saved you the trouble of further investigation." Giddings broke down completely once we pressed him. Admitted the whole thing, how he'd kept his key to the shop. How he'd been nursing his grudge these 4 months. How he'd gone there last night to confront Blackwood and struck him down in a moment of rage. How convenient. Holmes said dryly, his eyes scanning the room with that penetrating gaze. And the locked room? How does Giddings explain that particular impossibility? Lestrade consulted his notes. Says he panicked after striking the blow. Realized what he'd done and fled, pulling the door shut behind him. The bolt must have fallen into place by accident, or perhaps Blackwood had already locked it before the confrontation. "The bolt fell into place by accident," Holmes repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Inspector, have you examined that bolt mechanism? It requires deliberate manipulation. It cannot simply fall into the locked position." Well, perhaps Giddings is confused about the details. Lestrade said defensively. He was drunk at the time, by his own admission. The main facts are clear enough. He had motive, opportunity, and means. And he's confessed. What more do you want? "The truth," Holmes said coldly. "Inspector, this confession is a fabrication, and a clumsy one at that. Did Giddings explain how he escaped from a room bolted from the inside? Did he account for the missing weapon? Did he mention anything about the vanished commission Blackwood was working on? Lestrade's confidence wavered slightly. He said he took the weapon with him when he fled through it in the Thames. As for the commission, he claims to know nothing about it. And the locked door, well, as I said, the man was drunk and frightened. His memory of events is understandably hazy. How extraordinarily convenient that every impossible element of this crime is explained away by intoxication and panic. Holmes leaned forward, his voice intense. Inspector, I must insist on questioning Giddings myself. 5 minutes alone with him, and I will demonstrate beyond any doubt that this confession is false. Lestrade hesitated, clearly torn between his professional pride and his respect for Holmes's abilities. Mr. Holmes, the man has confessed. We have procedures to follow. I can't just— Then at least allow me to observe while you question him further, Holmes interrupted. Surely there can be no objection to that. If the confession is genuine, my presence will make no difference. But if it is false, as I strongly suspect, then you are about to let the real murderer walk free while an innocent man, albeit a thief and a drunkard, hangs for a crime he did not commit. The weight of this argument appeared to register with Lestrade. After a moment's consideration, he nodded reluctantly. Very well. But you're to observe only, Mr. Holmes. No interference with the questioning. We followed Lestrade down the corridor to the holding cells, our footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The air grew colder and damper as we descended, carrying the institutional smell of unwashed bodies and despair. Giddings sat slumped on a wooden bench in one of the cells, his head in his hands, the very picture of dejection. He was a man of perhaps 35, though dissipation had aged him prematurely. His clothes were shabby and stained, his face unshaven, his hands trembling with what I recognized as the early stages of alcohol withdrawal. When the guard unlocked the cell and Lestrade entered, Giddings looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held more fear than guilt. Mr. Giddings, Lestrade began, his tone official but not unkind. These gentlemen are here to hear your statement regarding the murder of Horace Blackwood. I want you to tell them exactly what you told me earlier. Giddings's eyes darted nervously to Holmes and myself, then back to Lestrade. I already told you everything. I killed him. I went to the shop last night, we argued, and I hit him. I didn't mean to kill him, I swear it. It was the drink talking, the anger. But I'm guilty, and I'm ready to hang for it. His words came out in a rehearsed rush, as if he were reciting lines learned by rote. Holmes said nothing, but I saw his eyes narrow as he studied the man's face, his posture, the nervous movements of his hands. What time did you arrive at the shop? Holmes asked quietly, breaking his silence despite Lestrade's disapproving glance. I'm not sure. Late. After dark. And how did you gain entry? Through the front door. I still had my key from when I worked there. The front door, Holmes repeated. Not the back entrance through the courtyard? Giddings hesitated, clearly uncertain. Yes, the front door. And once inside, you went directly to the press room on the second floor? That's right. Where you found Mr. Blackwood alone, working on his mysterious commission. He was there, yes. Working at the press. Holmes took a step closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Tell me, Mr. Giddings, what color was the ink on his hands? The question seemed to catch Giddings completely off guard. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I don't remember. Black, I suppose. It's always black ink, isn't it? Not always, Holmes said softly. Different jobs require different inks. A man who worked as a pressman for 3 years would know that. He turned to Lestrade with an expression of cold fury. This man did not kill Horace Blackwood, Inspector. He knows nothing about the crime scene, nothing about Blackwood's actual activities that night. This confession is worthless. Giddings's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his unshaven cheeks. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please just let it be. I'm guilty. I confess. Just let it end. Holmes moved with startling swiftness, grasping Giddings by the shoulders and forcing the trembling man to meet his eyes. Who put you up to this? Who told you to confess? What hold do they have over you? Mr. Holmes! Lestrade protested, but Holmes ignored him entirely, his focus locked on the terrified man before him. Was it Cunningham? Holmes demanded. Did Bernard Cunningham approach you? Did he offer you money or threaten you, or both? At the mention of Cunningham's name, Giddings's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went white as chalk, and his entire body began to shake violently. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. I don't know any Cunningham. I killed Blackwood, I'm telling you. You're telling me nothing but lies. Holmes released him and stepped back, his expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. Inspector, this man is protecting someone. The question is whether he does so out of loyalty, fear, or financial inducement. My money is on fear. He turned back to Giddings with slightly softer tone. Listen to me carefully. You are in serious danger. Whoever convinced you to take the blame for this murder will not allow you to live long enough to stand trial. A convenient suicide in your cell, perhaps, or an attack by another prisoner. There are a dozen ways to silence a man in custody. Giddings's eyes widened with naked terror, confirming Holmes's suspicions. You don't understand, he whispered. He said he promised. What did he promise? Holmes pressed. Money for your family? Protection for someone you care about? Whatever he offered, I assure you it was a lie. You are a loose end, Mr. Giddings, nothing more. And loose ends get cut. The man seemed on the verge of breaking entirely, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, and then a constable appeared at the cell door, his face flushed with agitation. Inspector Lestrade. Sir, there's been another incident at the Cunningham premises in Bloomsbury. A fire, sir. The building's ablaze, and Mr. Cunningham himself is reportedly trapped inside. Holmes and I exchanged a single electric glance. How long ago did this fire start? Holmes demanded. Can't be more than 20 minutes, sir. The alarm was raised just after 8 o'clock. Then there may still be time. Holmes was already moving, pushing past the constable and racing toward the stairs. I followed close behind, Lestrade shouting orders to his men as he struggled to keep pace. We burst out of Scotland Yard into the cool night air and immediately commandeered a police wagon. Holmes urging the driver to speed through the darkened streets with reckless abandon. As we rattled through the lamplit thoroughfares toward Bloomsbury, Holmes turned to me with grim determination. This is no accident, Watson. Cunningham is eliminating all evidence, and that includes himself. He knows we are closing in, knows that Giddings's confession will not hold up to scrutiny. Rather than face exposure and the gallows, he has chosen to destroy everything. But surely he wouldn't commit suicide by fire. I protested. It's a horrible way to die. Unless he has no intention of dying, Holmes said cryptically. Consider, Watson, a fire conveniently destroys all documentary evidence of his forgery operation. A body found in the ruins, burned beyond recognition, is assumed to be Cunningham. But what if it is not? What if this is an elaborate staging, allowing him to escape with a new identity while everyone believes him dead? The possibility chilled me to my core. Then we must reach the scene immediately and ensure no one leaves that building alive or dead. We arrived at Cunningham's premises to find the street already crowded with onlookers and fire brigade members struggling against the flames that poured from the upper windows of the 3-story building. The heat was intense even at a distance, and the roar of the conflagration drowned out most other sounds. The building housed both Cunningham's engraving workshop and his private residence, a substantial establishment that spoke of considerable wealth. Holmes leapt from the wagon before it had fully stopped, his eyes scanning the scene with fierce intensity. Lestrade, postmen at every exit front, back and sides. No one leaves this building without being thoroughly identified. Watson, come with me. Mr. Holmes. A fire brigade captain intercepted us as we approached. You cannot go in there, sir. The structure is unsound, and the heat. Is Bernard Cunningham still inside? Holmes demanded. We believe so, sir. His housekeeper managed to escape and says the master was in his workshop on the second floor when the fire started. We've attempted entry twice, but the stairs have collapsed and the smoke is too thick. Holmes's jaw tightened. Show me the rear of the building. Quickly. We followed the captain around to the back, where a smaller crowd had gathered and additional fire brigade members were training their hoses on the flames. Here, an iron fire escape clung to the brick wall, leading down from the upper floors. Holmes examined it intently. Even as the heat forced us to shield our faces. This escape is intact, he observed. Why would Cunningham not use it? Perhaps he was overcome by smoke before he could reach it, I suggested. Or perhaps, Holmes said slowly, he has already used it. He turned to scan the crowd of onlookers, his eyes moving from face to face with predatory focus. Watson, do you see anyone answering to Miss Blackwood's description of the mysterious visitor? Tall, distinguished, gray at the temples, carrying a silver-topped walking stick. I studied the crowd carefully, but the flickering firelight and churning smoke made clear observation difficult. I cannot be certain, Holmes. There are several men of that general description, but there. Holmes pointed suddenly toward a figure at the edge of the crowd, partially obscured by shadow. That man moving away from the scene rather than toward it. Come. We pushed through the press of bodies, Holmes moving with single-minded determination. The man he had spotted was indeed tall and well-dressed, and as we drew closer, I caught the glint of silver from the head of a walking stick, but the figure had noticed our pursuit and suddenly broke into a run, darting down a narrow alley that led away from the fire scene. Holmes gave chase immediately, his long legs carrying him forward with remarkable speed. I followed as best I could, my war-wounded leg protesting the exertion. While behind us I heard Lestrade shouting orders to his constables. The alley was dark and treacherous, littered with refuse and broken cobblestones. Our quarry was perhaps 30 yards ahead, his dark coat flapping as he ran. But Holmes was gaining, driven by that relentless energy that always seized him at the critical moment of a case. We emerged onto a broader street where a few late-evening pedestrians, scattered in alarm at the sight of 3 men racing through the darkness. The fleeing man made a desperate attempt to hail a passing cab. But Holmes closed the distance with a final burst of speed and seized him by the arm, spinning him around. In the gaslight, I got my first clear look at the face, and it was indeed distinguished. With gray temples and cold, calculating eyes that now blazed with fury and desperation. But it was not Bernard Cunningham. The man was older, perhaps 60, with features that spoke of aristocratic breeding. He struggled violently against Holmes's iron grip, but by now Lestrade and 2 burly constables had arrived, and within moments the man was secured in handcuffs. "Who are you?" Lestrade demanded, breathing heavily. "And why did you run?" The man remained silent, his jaw clenched, but Holmes was examining the silver-topped walking stick that had fallen during the struggle. He picked it up with careful fingers and twisted the ornate handle. To my astonishment, the top unscrewed to reveal a hollow interior containing several tightly rolled documents. "How fascinating," Holmes murmured, extracting the papers and holding them up to the gaslight. His eyes scanned the contents rapidly, and a grim smile crossed his features. "Bank drafts, Watson. Forged bank drafts drawn on the Bank of England, each one for £5,000. The quality is extraordinary. I dare say they would have passed scrutiny at most institutions. He looked up at our prisoner with cold contempt. "Allow me to introduce Sir Edmund Haverstoke, formerly of the Treasury Office, recently retired under somewhat clouded circumstances involving missing funds and accounting irregularities." The name meant nothing to me, but Lestrade's eyes widened in recognition. Haverstoke. But he was one of the most respected men in government finance. Was indeed, Holmes agreed. Until his creative accounting was discovered and he was quietly forced into retirement to avoid scandal. But pension and savings were not enough to maintain the lifestyle to which Sir Edmund had become accustomed, were they? So you conceived an ambitious plan. Use your insider knowledge of banking procedures and security features to create forgeries so perfect they would be undetectable. But you needed a printer of exceptional skill to execute the technical work. Bernard Cunningham, I breathed. He was the forger. Precisely. Cunningham had the technical expertise and the equipment. But when Horace Blackwood made his accusation at the guild meeting, your entire operation was threatened. You couldn't allow Blackwood to pursue his investigation, couldn't risk him uncovering the full scope of the forgery scheme. Holmes stepped closer to Haverstoke, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. So you threatened him. You sent those letters demanding he complete one final commission, not a forgery, but documentation you could use to blackmail him into silence. You asked him to provide you with personal information about his late wife, details that only he would know, so you could create the illusion that he had been complicit in your crimes all along. Haverstoke's silence was answer enough. Holmes continued, his reconstruction of the crime gaining momentum. But Blackwood was more courageous than you anticipated. Instead of succumbing to your blackmail, he used those late-night hours to compile evidence against both you and Cunningham. He gathered samples of the forged work, documented dates and transactions, prepared a complete case to present to the authorities. When you realized this, you had no choice but to act. And Cunningham carried out the murder, Lestrade interjected. He concealed himself in the press room, waited for Blackwood to lock himself in, then struck him down. Exactly so. Cunningham was your instrument, but you were the architect of the crime. And when Giddings was arrested, a convenient scapegoat with motive and opportunity, you saw a chance to close the case entirely. You approached him in his cell somehow, or perhaps through an intermediary, and convinced him to confess. Fear, money, or some combination thereof. Holmes turned his attention back to Haverstoke. But your accomplice became a liability. Cunningham knew too much, and his nerves were failing. So tonight, you set fire to his premises, intending to destroy all evidence and eliminate the one man who could implicate you directly. Whether Cunningham is truly dead in that fire, or whether you've helped him escape to begin a new life elsewhere, only time will tell. At this, Haverstoke finally spoke, his voice cultured but tinged with bitterness. You're very clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness and proof are different things. You have speculation and theory, nothing more. On the contrary, Holmes replied, holding up the forged drafts. I have these documents found in your possession. I have the letters you sent to Blackwood, which will match your handwriting. I have testimony from Miss Blackwood about your threatening visit to her father's shop. And most damningly, I have physical evidence from the print shop itself. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small envelope. You see, I visited the press room again this evening before coming to Scotland Yard, and I found precisely what I expected, a tiny hole drilled through the doorframe at the exact position, to allow manipulation of the bolt mechanism from outside. The hole was carefully plugged with wood filler after the murder to disguise its purpose, but the wood dust and metal filings were still present. And more importantly, I found this. From the envelope, he extracted a tiny fragment of metal wire. This was caught in the damaged bolt mechanism, overlooked in all the confusion of breaking down the door. It matches exactly the type of precision wire used in engraving work, Cunningham's specialty. It was the tool used to relock the door from outside after the murderer escaped, creating the illusion of an impossible crime. Haverstoke's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. In that moment, he looked every one of his 60 years. A man whose greed and desperation had led him to destroy not only his own life, but the lives of others. "Take him to the yard," Lestrade ordered his constables. As they led Haverstoke away, the inspector turned to Holmes with grudging admiration. "I don't mind admitting, Mr. Holmes, that I would never have unraveled this one without you. The locked room, the false confession, the connection to the forgery scheme, it was all too elaborate." "That was rather the point, Inspector," Holmes replied. "Haverstoke is an intelligent man who understood that complexity breeds confusion. Each impossible element was designed to distract from the simple underlying truth of man was murdered for threatening to expose a criminal enterprise. The locked room, the missing weapon, the vanished commission, all were misdirection. Stage dressing to obscure a straightforward motive." We returned to the fire scene to find the brigade had finally brought the blaze under control. In the smoldering ruins, they would eventually discover a body burned beyond recognition in what had been Cunningham's workshop. Whether it was truly Bernard Cunningham or some unfortunate victim of Haverstoke's ruthless pragmatism would require further investigation. But the forgery ring had been exposed, the murderer of Horace Blackwood identified. And justice would be served. As Holmes and I rode back to Baker Street in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally beginning to assert itself, I found myself reflecting on the intricate web of crime we had untangled. "Holmes," I said quietly, "when did you first suspect Haverstoke rather than Cunningham as the mastermind?" "The walking stick," he replied, lighting his pipe with steady hands. "Miss Blackwood's description of the mysterious visitor who tapped his silver-topped stick against the floor. It was such a specific detail, so characteristic. And when we learned of the forgery scheme, I asked myself who would have both the knowledge to create such perfect replicas of bank documents and the connections to distribute them successfully. A skilled engraver could create the physical forgeries, but only someone with insider knowledge of banking procedures could design documents that would pass institutional scrutiny. And the Treasury connection provided that knowledge. Precisely. Once I understood the scope of the operation, Haverstoke's involvement became almost inevitable. A man forced into retirement, resentful of his diminished circumstances. With detailed knowledge of how financial instruments are verified, he was the perfect candidate for such a scheme. Holmes paused, drawing deeply on his pipe. "The tragedy, Watson, is that Horace Blackwood was murdered simply for being a man of conscience. He saw evidence of wrongdoing and could not look away, even when threatened. That courage cost him his life. But it also brought his killers to justice," I observed. "Surely there is some consolation in that." "Perhaps. Though I suspect Miss Blackwood would gladly trade justice for her father's life." Holmes fell silent, gazing out at the dark streets rolling past. "Crime, Watson, is commonplace. But the courage to stand against it, knowing the cost, that is rare indeed." We arrived at Baker Street as dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Mrs. Hudson, roused by our late return, brought tea and expressed relief that we were safe. As Holmes settled into his chair with his pipe and the morning papers, I found myself marveling once again at the remarkable mind of my friend. The case of the whispers of murder in the print shop would become one of our most famous investigations, though many of the details had to be suppressed to protect certain government interests. Samuel Giddings was released immediately, his false confession explained away as the product of fear and confusion. Sir Edmund Haverstoke stood trial and was convicted, though he never revealed whether Bernard Cunningham had perished in the fire or escaped to begin a new life under an assumed name. For Miss Catherine Blackwood, there was the cold comfort of knowing her father had died a hero rather than a criminal, a man who had refused to compromise his principles even in the face of deadly threats. Holmes arranged for a portion of the reward money to be directed to her, ensuring her financial security in the years ahead. As for Holmes himself, he dismissed the entire affair with characteristic modesty. A simple matter of observation and logical deduction, Watson. The impossible is merely the improbable in disguise. Once one strips away the theatrical elements designed to confuse, most mysteries resolve themselves into rather mundane sequences of cause and effect. But I knew better. What Holmes called simple was the product of a mind unlike any other, capable of seeing connections, invisible to ordinary mortals, of penetrating deception through pure reason, of reconstructing entire sequences of events from the smallest fragments of evidence. That evening, as I sat recording the case in my journal, Holmes played his violin, a melancholy air that drifted through our rooms like smoke. When he finally set down the instrument, he caught my eye and smiled. "Another case closed, Watson. But the city sleeps only fitfully tonight. Tomorrow will bring new mysteries, new crimes, new puzzles to solve. And we shall be ready." I returned his smile and raised my glass in silent toast. Whatever challenges London might present, I knew that Sherlock Holmes would face them with that remarkable combination of intellect, courage, and dedication to justice that made him, in my estimation, the greatest detective the world had ever known. The fire in the grate burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls of 221B Baker Street. Outside, the great city settled into its evening rhythms, its millions of souls pursuing their various destinies. And somewhere in those teeming streets, I knew, another mystery was already taking shape, another case that would eventually find its way to our door. Another challenge for the singular genius of Sherlock Holmes. But that, as they say, is another story.